Hey, welcome back to the channel. Now, Linux can be a confusing thing for new users. What is Linux? How does it work? What do I choose? These are some of the questions that I get asked all the time. So with that in mind, I put together this high-level guide to explain what Linux is to new users. This is geared for new users. There will be some things that I omit for simplicity's sake, and it will not have the depth of information needed for many more experienced users. My goal with this is to take someone that knows very little about Linux and give them a better understanding of what it's all about. Now, I'll be breaking this down into several different sections, so I'll put an index down in the description that allows you to jump directly to any of those sections that interest you if you know about something or want to come back and visit it. And then at the end, I'll give you a breakdown on how to choose a distribution for you and some recommendations that I have. But if you skip right to the end, some of it may not make sense because I'm going to assume that you watch the rest of this video when I talk about those recommendations. All right, first of all, what is Linux? Linux is an operating system like Windows, Mac OS, iOS, or Android. In fact, Android is actually based on Linux, and it allows you to interact with the hardware of your computer, run tasks, and execute applications. All right, so if Linux is just an operating system, what makes it different than any other OS? Well, in this next section, I'm going to tell you. Linux, for the most part, is open source. Now, what this means is that the source code, or basically the DNA of the operating system, is available for anyone to look at and modify. This leads to a huge community of developers and users that add new features and bug fixes and have the power to shape the operating system the way that they see fit. Now, I just want to briefly talk about what are the components that make up Linux. Linux is made up of a few different parts. Some are required and some are optional for kind of an ease of use thing. These are not all the parts that make up Linux, but these are the core components to help give an understanding on how it's put together. The first component is the bootloader, and what this does is it manages the booting of the computer and the operating system and then passes it off to the other components, the next of which is the kernel. This is the core component that interfaces with the hardware of the computer, like the CPU, the RAM, etc. Then we're going to run some daemons. These are background services that transparently run to perform tasks like interfacing with the sound system, running tasks, checking if devices are plugged in, etc. Next is the shell. This is known as the command line. This allows you to interact with the operating system. So at a high level, those are the main core components of Linux. Everything else that I'm going to talk about will provide graphical access to your operating system, but most servers are run with just these. They have the command line access and they don't have a graphical access, but running it on your desktop, you probably want a graphical interface to make things a little bit easier. In order to get that graphical interface, we need a graphical server, typically called X server. This provides the graphical interface to facilitate a more visual interaction with your computer. On top of that is a desktop environment. There's several different desktop environments. I'll go into that later. This sits between the graphical server and you and provides that visual interface that you actually interact with. Now, there's many different types of desktop environments. They all have different visuals, different methods for accomplishing tasks, but essentially all do the same thing. They allow you to graphically interact with your computer. Now, next up, of course, we have applications. These are the individual programs that perform specific tasks like web browsers, Office applications, games, and things like that. That is basically the core components for your Linux operating system. And when you get a distribution, those are all going to be included. I'll talk a little bit more about distributions in just a minute here. Now, when we talk about Linux, it's kind of an ambiguous term. There's different types of Linux, so I am going to touch on some of those. This could be a topic in itself, so I'm only going to go over some of the most popular or commonly used on home computers. Each of these handle applications and system interaction differently, and many are the base of which other distributions are built on. The first of those types is Debian. If you've ever heard of Ubuntu or Linux Mint, this is what those are based on. It has a very large community, it's very stable, it uses .deb files or a package manager that accesses software repositories to install applications. Next up is Arch Linux, and if you've ever heard of Manjaro, that's what this is based on. It's a rolling distribution, so it has more recent packages. It uses a package manager with software repositories and the AUR. AUR stands for Arch User Repository. It's a community-driven repository for Arch users, so people can package applications that aren't in the default repositories and put them into a AUR where other users can go and install those. So the third type I'm going to talk about, and again, there are more, is Fedora. It's a community developed but Red Hat corporate backed distribution. It was originally geared for production systems, but the workstation version of Fedora can be used by anyone. It uses RBM packages and a package manager with software repositories. Okay, a couple of times I mentioned repositories. So what are repositories? Repositories are basically just a large database of applications and pointers to the installers for those applications. So say you want to install LibreOffice or something like that, you can go into your package manager, type in LibreOffice, it'll go to the database, find that entry, find the pointers to the latest version, and let you install that all from a graphical interface. And most types of Linux and most distributions have some sort of repositories associated with their systems. All right, the next thing I keep mentioning is distributions. So what are distributions? Well, distributions contain the core components as well as normally a desktop environment and set of installed applications for Linux. Distributions are normally provided as a .iso file, so you can use an application like Rufus or Etcher to burn that ISO onto a USB thumb drive. You can then boot off that thumb drive to get into the graphical installer for that distribution. Now, there are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of distributions, so I'm going to mention some of them, but I'm only going to mention the ones at the top of the distrowatch.com list. All right, first up is Ubuntu. Ubuntu is based on Debian and is the distribution with the largest user base and arguably the largest support base. Ubuntu is on a scheduled release with a new version coming out every 6 months and a new long-term support version that comes out every 2 years. Long-term support versions receive fixes and security patches for up to 5 years, while the other releases will receive that support for 9 months. Because of this update schedule, Ubuntu is very stable, but it does cause there to be some older versions of the software in the official repositories. You can get around that by installing third-party repositories. There are several different variations of Ubuntu depending on the desktop environment you want, such as Kubuntu that uses the KDE Plasma desktop environment, Xubuntu uses XFCE, Ubuntu Mate uses the Mate desktop, etc. There are tons and tons of them. Next up is Linux Mint. Linux Mint is based on Debian or Ubuntu, depending on the version that you download. Linux Mint has a very similar release cycle to Ubuntu and very similar stability. Because of the theming of the interface and the tools that are provided, it's considered by many to be the most user-friendly Linux distribution. Again, that's debatable. And there are several versions of Linux Mint, just like Ubuntu, depending on the desktop environment that you want and the base that you want. Next, I want to talk about Manjaro, and as mentioned earlier, Manjaro is based on Arch Linux. Because it's based on Arch, there's really no release cycle as it's a rolling release. This means it will get system updates and application updates shortly after the release to the community. It is an excellent distribution, combining the rolling benefits of Arch with packages held for a bit longer to check for stability. This next one I have to talk about because it is extremely popular right now, and that is MX Linux. MX Linux is based on Debian Stable, and it provides official releases once a year, but will release point releases when needed for major system updates or system changes. It's currently the most popular distro on distrowatch.com, and it has a combination of simple configuration, stability, and performance, and some great tools that are packaged with that distribution. Now, I've mentioned packages a couple times in this video, and you may have heard that term. So what are packages? The term packages or software packages in Linux refers to an archived version of a software application. Sometimes these are self-contained and runnable, kind of like an .exe in the Windows world, and sometimes they provide a mechanism for installing the application. Different distributions use different packages. For instance, Debian-based distros use .deb files, Fedora or Red Hat-based distributions use RPM files. Now, this is part of what adds to some confusion to some Linux users. And because of that, there are some distribution-independent packaging methods that have come to light over the last few years. The two most popular used right now are Snap and Flatpak. Snap and Flatpak both provide software packages that can be installed on whatever base you're on, so you don't have to worry about what type of specific packages your distribution needs. You can set up the support for Snap or Flatpak and install those. Many Linux software providers are switching to these methods of delivery for easy maintenance, providing software upgrades, and very centralized management. All right, so with all this talk about applications, what exactly can you run on Linux? The short and simple answer is you can run applications that were written for Linux and run in the distribution that you're using. If you stick to the software repositories, which again is kind of similar to the store in Windows or Mac OS, then you will be good to go. These applications were tested with your distribution and certified to work. Now, that being said, there are ways to get some Windows applications working in Linux. I won't go into too much detail here, just provide an overview and provide links down in the description if you want more information. But the first of those methods is for Windows games. In Steam, you can use Steam Play to play some Windows games. Not all of them work. This uses a technology called Proton to more or less kind of translate the game so that the Windows calls get translated to Linux calls. So it's not an emulator, it's more of a translator. Not everything works, but for the games that do work, it actually works pretty well. Now, apart from games, there are ways to get some Windows applications working with a framework called Wine. This also does some of that translation between the Windows and Linux calls and will allow you to run some Windows applications in Linux. For more information and a list of the status of Windows applications in Wine, you can go to winehq.com. Once you get out there, you can type in the application that you want to install and see if it works in Wine, and if it does, what version it works with. Okay, so now we're at the point where I try to help you make a decision on what distribution to choose. Now, hopefully you didn't just skip here, because if you did, some of this may not make sense, because I'm going to assume you watch the rest of the video. Now, this is a very difficult question to answer, as a lot of it is personal preference, so I'll give some steps on how to choose your distribution and then some recommendations on distributions to try. Number one, identify the computer that you'll be running on. Is this a standard AMD or Intel-based PC? If so, then most distributions will support it just fine. Do you want to run it on something like a Raspberry Pi? Or if so, you may need to find a distribution that supports that machine architecture. Number two, figure out what base you want. Do you want something that's very stable or something that always gets the latest and greatest software versions? If stability is more of a concern, then go with something like Ubuntu or Linux Mint. If you want the latest and greatest versions with reasonable amount of stability but not as stable, you may want to go with something like Manjaro. Number three, decide on the desktop environment that you want to use. This part is very tricky. The best thing to do is Google Linux desktop environments and then watch a bunch of videos on the different environments to see which one you like. They all do pretty much the same thing, but some of them handle it very differently than others. Some are very simple and some are very flashy and have lots of eye candy. The good thing is that even if you install a distribution with one desktop environment, you can change to another desktop environment without having to completely reinstall your distribution. So now that you figured out what you want to run it on, what kind of environment you want, and what base you want, you can find the distribution that meets those needs. Very good resources for that are to ask on Reddit, and also look at the popular distributions on DistroWatch. If you still want a little more help, here are some of my recommendations for new users. Again, these are specifically for new users. If you're just getting started with Linux, I would say stay away from a rolling distribution. I personally love them, but if you have no experience, they can be a bit frustrating And it might be better to wait until you have a little more experience with Linux, because rolling distributions do tend to break from time to time because you're getting the latest and greatest software and system patches. With that in mind, I recommend Ubuntu, Linux Mint, or Linux FX, which I haven't talked about yet. All three of those distributions are based on Ubuntu and Debian at a deeper level, and are all very stable. The default Ubuntu interface uses GNOME, and while it's a very nice user-friendly interface, it may take some getting used to. Linux Mint is based on Ubuntu and has a familiar to Windows users anyway, taskbar at the bottom with a typical application menu in the bottom left corner. This is probably more familiar to most users than the default Ubuntu installation. Linux FX is the new kid on the block. It's based on Ubuntu, but themed to look very, very much like Windows 10. I'll put a link down in the description and in the corner to a video I did on Linux FX. If you're coming from Windows 10 and like that interface, this one may be the way to go. Like I mentioned, it's relatively new, although it's been around since about 2016, but it's built on a stable Ubuntu base. And again, if you're familiar with Windows 10, you'll be very familiar with this distribution. Now, to wrap this all up, I know this was a lot of information, but feel free to come back and use that index to jump to parts that you want to rewatch. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the comment section below. Also, you can reach out to me on Twitter and Instagram. I'm happy to answer questions on there as well. If you found this video useful or informative, please hit that thumbs up or consider subscribing if you haven't done so already, and I will see you in the next video. Thanks for stopping by.